This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers, and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Reiland Rabaka, who teaches in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of Colorado at Boulder, where he is the founder and director of the Center for African and African American Studies. He is the author of a number of important books in the Black Atlantic intellectual tradition, including Du Bois's Dialectics from 2009, Africana Critical Theory from 2010, Forms of Fanonism from 2011, and most recently, Black Women's Liberation Music from 2023 and the Funk Movement from 2024. In this conversation, we discuss the place of musical performance in the formation of Black intellectual life, the expansive nature of Black studies as a political and liberatory movement, and the importance of thinking in the present even as we reckon with the past and imagine a future. Good afternoon, Reiland. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How about yourself, John?
I'm fantastic. Welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. I'm really excited about this conversation. Been looking forward to it. Had you on the list when we were putting together the podcast aims and goals. I really love your work. It's fantastic. I will say that you set an impossible standard for those of us who are ambitious writers.
I want to say that there's a mutual appreciation for your work and the contributions that you have made. Also, it's really important for me to state that up front. And so I believe there's a lot of mutual respect and moral recognition that's about to take place this afternoon.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. Really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on the field of Black studies, your perspective, how you think about your work in relation to the history and future of the field. But before we get into that, I wanted to start with a more personal question and just ask you, what is it that drew you to the study of Black life? What's your intellectual and ethical and political origin story? And what drew you not only to the study of Black life, but to Black studies as a field? And what sustains you in relation to both?
Well, let me start by saying that's a dissertation topic that I could write about this, and I think I have been for much of my career. But to answer your question more directly, African American art and culture is where I started. So I started out as a youth minister of music in the church, in the African American church, and I'm a PK for any of your African American listeners. That means I'm a preacher's kid, and so I started out, gospel music is my first great love, and as you know, Brother John, the Black church, as Du Bois said in the Philadelphia Negro, the Black church is the backbone of Black American culture, of African American culture, and you can't name any aspect of Black studies that has not been touched by the Black church, whether we talk about Black psychology, whether we talk about Black economics, whether we talk about Black history, whether we talk about Black art, especially our music and our dance. You can't name a single aspect of African American culture that the African American church has not informed. And so I want to start there with the Black sacred, with the Black spiritual, if you will, before I go into the secular. And so growing up in the church, being a gospel musician early on, and the rigor, John, most people don't realize it, but having to, when you are going to church on Sunday, you perform, you have choir rehearsal on Saturday, and then you have Wednesday night prayer meeting. That's 3 times a week. As a young musician, there's a kind of discipline there. And then, of course, John, I could bring up Black performativity, how there's another level, if you will, that goes on with your artistry, because we're talking about, when you start talking about Black spiritual culture, it's an incredibly expressive culture, you see. And it was the gospel aesthetic informs so much of how I teach and how much I think about the world. But from gospel music, my mother allowed, you couldn't study gospel musicianship in school. And my mother allowed me to play jazz music. And it was jazz, this quote unquote secular music. Again, maybe they've never heard Duke Ellington's Sacred Concerts or something. John Coltrane's The Love Supreme. I actually hear profound spirituality all throughout jazz music. Maybe they'd never heard of Mary Lou Williams or Yusef Lateef, right? Or Charles Mingus. He got a song called Wednesday Night Prayer Meeting. So I wasn't the only one jazz kid that was profoundly influenced by the African American church. But I'm trying to connect some dots for you today, John. And so my mother would allow me to perform jazz music. And John, when I was 9 years old, that's when I became professional. I got my first $100 bill playing a bar mitzvah, 9 years old. And my life changed that day because, I grew up in the projects. So when you can command that kind of money for performing outside of the church, obviously, something is going to shift just because of economics. Mm-hmm. And I kind of joke and say I got half of a childhood compared to my brothers. And instead of being able to have your childhood, 0 to 18, at 9 years old, I really started performing a great deal in, jazz venues and everything else. I was so young. I remember the piano player had to tie a little string from his ankle to my ankle to make sure I didn't run off and the club would lose its liquor license. Maybe I shouldn't tell all of that part. But anyway, so I feel like it's the art though. It was John Coltrane having a song called Africa. John Coltrane having a song called The Song of the Underground Railroad. Duke Ellington having a suite called The Black, Brown, and Beige Suite. Billie Holiday singing Strange Fruit in 1939. I could just go on and on and on, but all of these references to not simply African American culture, but to Africa and to other parts of the African diaspora. It's the art that really led me into what we call Black studies, African American studies, Africana studies, Pan-African studies. And something happened, John. So I was the little kid that they would bus out of the projects to these elite art schools, and they was always in the suburbs. So as Malcolm said in his autobiography, there was nobody more thoroughly integrated than I was, because I'm surrounded. They only allowed oftentimes one little Black child in these elite arts conservatories in terms of public education, kindergarten, K through 12. And to be exposed in the first grade to the Harlem Renaissance and to see the first time I saw Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, Countee Cullen, Nella Larson, Jesse Fawcett, I could go on. And they looked like me and my mama and them. That was my introduction to Black studies, was studying the Harlem Renaissance. And in the Harlem Renaissance, as you know, the foregrounding of Black feminists and Black queer identities also let me know that there was a lot of different ways to be Black. There wasn't just one way to be Black. And of course, with my introduction to the Harlem Renaissance, it also served as an introduction to the impresario of the Harlem Renaissance, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. Everybody knows that the Souls of Black Folk was a precursor. It prefigured what was possible in terms of Black art, Black culture, Black literature. You see, so that's 1903. About 12 years later, you get really what we argue is the genesis of the Harlem Renaissance in about 1915, and that flows all the way through to about 1945. So the Harlem Renaissance really, and Black art, was my introduction to Black history and Black culture and this thing that we're calling Black studies.
Yeah, look, and I love this question. People's way into the field and into the study of Black life, I think, is just so interesting. And I love this combination of books and sound, right? I mean, I think the distinction between books and sound is a there's a lot of overlap there. But I love your identification of Black studies content in the sound of a Coltrane song or an Ellington suite. That was just wonderfully put. And the fact that you were a practicing musician tunes you into it, of course, but it's also something that I myself in the classroom, I'm always trying to get students to connect to. I just think about, when I teach Ellison's prologue to Invisible Man, the students really, like a lot of this about making life and sound inside the cracks. And then we listen to Black and Blue and they hear Armstrong play the trumpet. And it's amazing to me how, somebody like Armstrong, a sort of 18 to 22-year-old sort of knows his gravelly voice and, it's iconic. But they hear that trumpet and they're like, oh, that's what Ellison is trying to write. And it's that moment that they're reading arguably the greatest novel in U.S. history, and they're hearing this sound of the trumpet, not the lyrics, not the singer, but they're hearing the sound of the trumpet, the way it has fits and starts, and start to see something essential about Ellison, about African-American life. And so this notion, I love this picture of you as a 9-year-old sort of entering that space. That's just beautiful. And then to find out that connection with books just by luck. And the idea of studying the Harlem Renaissance, in K through 12 continues to be rare. And so
John, I would say to you that my first grade teacher, this was at a time where America still was awkwardly integrating itself. So I had more African-American teachers and Mexican-American teachers back then. And this was Black History Month. And my first grade teacher, Mrs. Robinson, had these little placards, these little cards. And they had these, Black figures on them. And somebody else got Duke Ellington, somebody else got Billie Holiday and Charles Mingus and Langston Hughes on their. I was upset, you see. Because my first grade teacher, Ms. Robinson, gave me a card that I thought had a French man on it. And I said, well, Lord have mercy. It's Black History Month. Can I get a Black person? It's Black History Month, right? And I didn't realize that this, the person I thought was a Frenchman was actually one of the most illustrious intellectuals the United States of America has ever produced, W.E.B. Du Bois. And that changed my life as well, because once I got a chance to study a little bit more about Du Bois, you realize not only did he inaugurate sociology in the United States of America, but he also wrote 5 novels, 9 volumes of poetry, 3 dozen short stories, 2 dozen plays. And so Du Bois was a figure that allowed me to have a model for what does it mean to be both an artist and a social scientist? What does it mean to be an activist and an intellectual? So instead of either or, in Black studies, we say both and. So you don't have to be either or, right? John, we can be both and. And so it's instead of being something linear, we could actually be, I'm moving my hand, I'm doing the wave right now. We could be curvilinear. You see what I'm saying? And so that kind of mindset, even the way that Black studies articulates its core values, is very different compared to a lot of other academic disciplines. And, in fact, I'd like to say it's so much more than an academic discipline.
Yeah. That leads me into this next question, which is to ask you how you imagine the field of Black studies. It has this really interesting origin story that is responding to a couple of imperatives and demands. One is that the disciplines had completely failed to document, study, and develop our understanding of Black life. And so Black studies became this place where you could do that kind of work, and it continues to be that, the cultivation of the Black intellectual tradition. But it was also, of course, at a time when Black liberation struggle was really contesting the idea of these boundaries between something like a university and a community, and demanding in that way that there be a field of Black studies, that there be professors, departments of Black studies that would have political prescriptions to transform the material conditions of Black people's lives. And so it has that origin, right, of intellectual tradition and political prescription. They're in tension with each other, right? But they also happen at the same time. It's 54 years ago or so or more. And so I think it's kind of this moment for us to reflect on how we, when we imagine Black studies, imagine it in relation to this origin story. So how does it function for you in relation to this origin story? And what is your sort of picture, your imagination of the field?
That's a profound question. I go back to one of the founders of modern Black studies in the late 1960s, Nathan Hare. When Nathan Hare says that knowledge should flow from the community to the campus and from the campus to the community, that a real Black studies scholar, a real Black studies student is a bridge, right? Between the campus and the community, that we literally are crossing borders and breaking down boundaries. And this academization of a lot of what had been happening in Black reading groups since the Harlem Renaissance days, if not even before. This is how we got HBCUs, right? Because they would not allow us to be a part of sort of mainstream American education, K through 12, and then certainly not higher education. So this is a really, really big deal, if you will. And it goes beyond Du Bois's early articulation, if not misarticulation, of a talented tenth. We need more than just 10%, if you will, of Black folk to have access to education. Why? Because in Black studies, we say that education is a fundamental human right. And so if you deny people, which America did, deny Black folk education for 250 years, as Du Bois said in The Souls of Black Folk, it is like breaking our legs and then demanding that we run a race, you see. Yeah. And so we can't help but to lag a little bit behind. So it's really important for us to understand the profundity, the functionality, the necessity of education, John, but not just any education. See, this is where it's clear. There are some specific things about Black love, Black life, Black struggle that it's important not simply for Black people to know, but for all people to know, right? My position is Black studies isn't just for Black people. Black studies is for anybody that's interested in embracing their humanity and acknowledging our shared humanity, which is why I say Ubuntu, right? That we actually share humanity. And the only way for you to fully be human is to acknowledge my humanity and fight for my humanity. And the only way I can fully be human is to acknowledge your humanity and fight for your humanity. It is only together that we can actually achieve bona fide humanhood. This is what, I know I sound like James Baldwin, but when Baldwin talks about how America will not be able to achieve democracy until Black folk in America achieve democracy. See, we like a litmus test. Yeah. Right? The people that was here in shackles and chains, the people that survived the Middle Passage, when those people, the descendants of the enslaved, when they actually achieve democracy, only then will America be a truly democratic society.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's fantastic. And I think these kinds of imperatives of Black studies can easily get lost. But also I do think, and I like to think in broader moments or broader terms than our particular moments, but particular moments are real. And the way Black studies is going to be, has been, but is really, I think, going to be intensively under siege. This question about the relationship between what we do when we write and we study and we teach, and these kinds of political transformations, interventions around questions of humanity, around democracy, around poverty, around justice, it's just going to become so much sharper. I mean, I don't think it's ever not been sharp. I mean, right. I think it's too much to say people haven't taken this seriously, but boy, are we about to really have it on our front step as an imperative.
John, I would also say that my conception of Black studies is it is fundamentally human studies. You see, it's important for me to articulate that in a very full-throated fashion, because what else is the Middle Passage and the enslavement of our people from 1619 to 1865? That is an attempt to dehumanize, right? So that attempted dehumanization, this is the response where you can see in Black studies, there's an intense affirmation of Black humanity, right? And it's really important for us to sort of underscore this. And I think that there's a tendency, let's be honest, there's some real abstract elements of Black studies right now, where actually Black people who don't have college degrees are going to have great difficulty understanding a lot of the discourse. And so for me at this point in my career, now again, I want to be self-critical. Earlier on, you'd need 3 dictionaries, an encyclopedia set, and maybe 4 or 5 thesauruses to work through some of my work. But I'm at a point right now where you can see this accentuation of Black musicality in poetry, in literature, even in film, you see, even in sociology, in our historical texts, in our political science texts, even in psychology. And so you can see a real shift in my work where I've sort of come 360 back to the soundtracks of Black life. And I believe, as you probably already know this, one of my theses in my musicology, my music history, music criticism work, I believe, John, that African Americans have been able to say what we want to say via song better than we can say it with words. So we can express profound, deep, epistemological, philosophical, ethical, moral, social visions, political critique via our arts in ways that we have not been able to sufficiently, or at least not be heard with our words, certainly our highbrow words and so on and so forth. I'm not saying that we haven't had geniuses that come through like a James Baldwin or an Audre Lorde, or, who've been able to sort of do that. But Baldwin writes various musical texts, right? Right. You ever read Jimmy's Blues by James Baldwin? Right. Look at somebody like an Reiland Rabaka or a Zora Neale Hurston, or dare I say an Alice Walker, right? Or Toni Morrison. These are, their work is grounded in our cultural expressions often double as artistic expressions and articulations. It's really, really, when I look at Alvin Ailey's Revelation, you see, you're seeing something so profound. It's really important to understand some of the limitations of our social location in this country.
Yeah.
So we are often able to really say what needs to be said via our dance pieces, or via that comedy special, or via that song, or via that painting, or that multimedia, via a cipher circle. I'm really into hip hop, right? So look at the way Kendrick Lamar can come out with an album called To Pimp a Butterfly in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement. Got a song called All Right, where he keeps saying, we gonna be all right, it's gonna be all right. And people, it's not a coincidence that would become a theme song, an anthem of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, exactly.
And so he's able to sort of keep up with the pulse of the people. And that's what the real Black studies scholar should keep up with, the pulse of the people. You shouldn't just be publishing in the highbrow journals where 300-400 of your friends gonna read your piece. Like, what about bringing some of the poetry back? I ain't gonna bring up Gil Scott-Heron. I'm not gonna bring up Jane Cortez. What about bringing some of the June Jordan, some of the people's poetry, bringing that back to make sure that our work is as accessible to people that will never be able to come to our classrooms, John, than those students that are able to pay however much they're paying at these universities where we're teaching at. I feel a moral obligation to make my ideas accessible to as wide an audience as possible. You didn't ask me, but I'm gonna tell you anyway. And since I'm teaching Black studies at the University of Colorado, Boulder, since I'm teaching Black studies at a school with 36,000 students and roughly only about 1,000 Black students, the question needs to be raised. How do people like you and I at predominantly white universities, what are the special challenges of us teaching Black studies at predominantly white universities? Right? See, that's a critical question right now, where you do have the academization and more departments and programs popping up in spaces where they have very, very few of the people with the actual lived experience. Now, again, my position is, Black studies isn't just for Black people. I want to share this culture as widely as I possibly can. That's what makes it a beautiful human culture and civilization. However, there are some special challenges to us teaching in predominantly white classrooms in the suburbs. Most of us are in these cushy institutions that are in the burbs, in the suburbs, right? As George Clinton said, they're not in the chocolate cities, they in the vanilla suburbs, right? I'm making a reference to one of my favorite albums by Parliament Funkadelic, Chocolate City. He's, of course, referring to Washington, D.C., not that far from you, right?
Yeah.
This is profound. John, we need to have some conversation about that as well.
Yeah.
What does that mean? And for me, why is it so important for me to ride out to Denver, Colorado, come down the mountain, if you will, to Denver, Colorado, and to make sure I'm hitting up some of those town halls and some of those high schools and churches and mosques and synagogues and spiritual temples in Denver to make sure that we're reaching a wider audience? Because for me, Black Studies is fundamentally about love and liberation.
Well, I love there was so many things there to talk about, and I mean, I think this challenge you're talking about is in so many ways about what it means to both be in the institution of the university, right, where we have tenure requirements, where we have our own communities, where, we have validation, we have curiosity, imagination, and all of that, but also to be working in a field that has not only as its origin point, but as its content of the texts we teach, a vision of liberation, right, that has to connect in some sort of material way. And how we do that, I mean, I would love there to be more and more conversations about how to do that with integrity and respect, because one of the things I never like is, no one likes it, but these kind of missionary models of like, we're going to go out, but rather how are we participants, right? I'm thinking about this podcast that came out just a couple weeks ago with Ashante Reese, and she said, my first question in Black Studies is, how can I help? And I really love that as a way of talking about the kinds of things you're talking about there.
So we are servants. And a lot of that thought has origins. I'm going to say it to you slow, Professor Drabensky. A lot of that has origins in the first wave of the civil rights movement, which most people have erased or rendered invisible. I'm talking about Ralph Ellison's invisibility. So Black invisibility in America. So we invisible, our real lives, our real struggles, our real culture, and we're hyper visible when it comes to a lot of stereotypes and myths. And so there's a dialectic there, and we have to dance with that. But a lot of that impulse of what you just talked about, this humble, reverent service, was initially popularized after our enslavement by the National Association of Colored Women, right? The National Association of Colored Women, whose motto was lifting as we climb. And it was the National Association of Colored Women that took in a 15, 16-year-old young man who was orphaned. His daddy was never around, and his mother passed away when he was in high school. And his name was William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. And so that impulse to help the unwed mothers, this is all the way back in the 1880s, 1890s, right? To help the unwed mother, to help people dealing with alcoholism, to help people, whose children are been abandoned or they've orphaned and everything. They took this young person in, helped the brother. He wanted to go to Harvard, but Harvard wasn't letting Negroes in, as Du Bois says in his autobiography, right? So he had to go to an HBCU down south, Fisk. Then after he went to Fisk, as you know, he went on up to Harvard, so on and so forth. But it's profound. Most people don't realize they would just attribute it to the NAACP without saying, well, actually, Du Bois even named his organization as a tribute to his surrogate mothers and the National Association of Colored Women, right, whose motto was lifting as we climb. And again, it's that impulse, John. We need to embrace that lifting as we climb. If I get up, you gonna get up, right? If I get up, we get up, right? It's one of those kinds of things. And some of that is still in hip hop culture when the hip hop generation says each one teach one. Right?
Yeah.
Right. When the hip hop generation say, if I got a dime, you got a nickel, baby. Right. I mean, that kind of impulse, that we need to remix that. We need to recycle that. We need to bring that forward. And I think that's why, you didn't ask, but I'm gonna tell you anyway. That's why in my work, you can see there's a classical dimension with the Harlem Renaissance, with Du Bois, with the National Association of Colored Women, even with the National Council of Negro Women, Mary McLeod Bethune. But there's also a contemporary wing of my work that's looking at the hip hop movement, right? That's looking at the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I think that all of us need sort of an intellectual and a curricular arc in our work. But right now, oftentimes, at least in Black studies, it seems, it may not be the case, John. It seems that there's a tendency to do like a lot of the mainstream disciplines, and we're training students almost with over specialization in these very sort of nuanced little niche areas. And I think some of the wider swaths, I mean, one of the reasons I really am interested in developing an Africana critical theory is because I do think it's important to couple history and philosophy with the social sciences. So it's not either or. Like, I'm somebody who is not only a faculty member in an ethnic studies department, which is a social science, which is in the social science division here at the University of Colorado Boulder, but I'm also a core faculty member in humanities. I also have appointments in the College of Music out here. So a lot of my work and the way I conceive of African American studies, African and African American studies, Black studies, it's transdisciplinary, meaning it transcends and transgresses the boundaries and borders, which are very arbitrary and artificial, of academic disciplines. We can't have the same Eurocentric, heteropatriarchal, bourgeois conception of an academic discipline. We have to explode those boundaries and say, you know, I'm going to take from whatever discipline I possibly can, because my preoccupation is with getting free. How can we get free? Yes, John, I'm making a reference to one of my favorite hip hop groups called Dead Prez. Their first album is called Let's Get Free, right? And they're some of the more thoughtful political rappers, message rappers, conscious rappers out there. And again, this whole notion, I'm also referencing another one of their albums, which is called Pulse of the People. I think it's important for Black studies scholars and students to keep up with what's actually happening in the hood and to acknowledge that what happens in barbershops and beauty shops, in mosques and churches and synagogues and spiritual centers, what happens sitting around the kitchen table, what happens, John, when you and I chop it up over dinner, when we break bread together, that's also a co-creation of knowledge. Knowledge is not just being created in higher education, academic institutions. Knowledge is being created wherever Black people are, and we can develop a discourse. I'm also saying, John, knowledge is also created in jazz clubs. Knowledge is also created in public theaters. Knowledge is also created in dance studios, you know. Knowledge is also created in art galleries. You see, I mean, you look at the influence of how that early grounding in the Harlem Renaissance really gave me an aesthetic, like almost a radical aesthetic model for the possibilities, if you will, the limitless possibilities of what it is that we mean by Black studies.
So, I mean, this is a nice segue into this next question, because you've outlined so many of the elements that go into your work, you know, study of music, critical theory, transnational political and cultural imagination. And so I'm interested, you know, when you think about your work, how do you see it in relation to the history of the field of Black studies? You know, where do you see it fitting? And also, where do you see it pushing and opening up new horizons?
John, I appreciate the question. I'm going to try to practice literary economy, even though it's going to be difficult, because you keep asking me about one of my favorite topics, right? Which is, you know, African American studies, Black studies. My work in relationship to the origins and the evolution of Black studies goes back, obviously, to Frederick Douglass's study of Harriet Tubman. See, if you go back and get a book called Frederick Douglass on Women's Rights, there's this beautiful letter that he wrote to Harriet Tubman, where he said that she was his beacon of hope, that she provided him with the model for life and liberation, essentially. And from Frederick Douglass, we could fast forward to obviously somebody like Anna Julia Cooper, W.B. Du Bois. From there, we could go on to Marcus Garvey and Ida B. Wells. But I believe that what we're calling Black studies, African American studies, African studies, Africana studies has origins all the way back during those early Black abolitionists. Right? For me, it's really, really important. And I want to shout out Benjamin Quarles' work on the Black abolitionists. It's really important to understand that our Black intellectual history is qualitatively different than a lot of other forms of intellectual history because we were operating under conditions where it was illegal for us to learn to read and write. Hence the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. He had to steal the pages of the Bible to teach himself how to read, right? That's an intellectual tradition born of struggle. That's an intellectual tradition that begins in a moment of enslavement. Now, John, I'm going to ask you a rhetorical question. Can you name another intellectual tradition, intellectual culture in the United States of America that begins under conditions of enslavement, where people are literally wearing shackles and chains, being beaten and whipped each and every day for 250 years? That's a qualitatively different kind of intellectual culture.
Yeah. And as you know, you referenced Douglass's narrative. I mean, there's that passage. It's for me is the one that stands out most of all, where he talks about walking and he hears enslaved people singing in the distance.
Yeah.
And he says that sound, and he says about that sound, he said, no more profound philosophy has ever found its way into words. And so when you're talking about sound and origins and also the unprecedented and the singular origins of a tradition, right? They come together in that moment where Douglass, there's no greater writer in the 19th century saying the real philosophy was the sound I heard in the distance.
And John, I appreciate what you're saying. And I feel like we Run DMC or Salt and Pepper. We just traded. I would say Chuck D and Flavor Flav, but nobody's clowning in here. So, John,
hopefully not.
John, do you also hear that you broach the relationality of African American enslavement to the origins of American democracy? See, there's no way to really even talk about the origins and early evolution of American democracy without talking about this profound contradiction, this stain, if you will, on American democracy early on. And all I would say to you, Brother John, is that there are many non-Black people, such as yourself, who actually understand and appreciate the profundity, the majesty of the African-American experience, from enslavement all the way through to where we are today, quasi-freedom, because we're not fully free, let's be honest, okay? And so this is profound because now we're talking about something that Barry Gordy was able to do with Motown. Barry Gordy took that sound and universalized it, or at least showed people how if you get these young folks out of the Frederick Douglass projects in Detroit, Michigan, and groom them and let them sing in a way that's still Black, but also accessible to non-Black people around the world. That's the great metaphor of Motown as well. And we need some Barry Gordys in Black studies. We need some people that can make this work more accessible. This is Miles Davis with that stroke of genius with Kinda Blue in 1959, where he helped to popularize that jazz sound, that post-bop sound.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that's part of me being out here in this Africana Studies outpost at the University of Colorado, Boulder. I'm attempting to make this work accessible, first and foremost, to our own people, but also, I mean, John, if I'm teaching a hip hop class that got 300 students in it, well, at the University of Colorado, Boulder, I may be blessed enough to have about 30 Black students. The majority of my students have always been non-Black students out here. That takes a different skill. You talked earlier about being from Los Angeles, California. Well, as you know, I was teaching in LA for 5 years before I came here. That was a culture shock. It was a curricular culture shock. It was a shock on socially, politically, in every way. But how do we translate right? As Bell Hooks says in her 1983 book, Feminist Theory, how do we translate our pedagogies? She was talking about a feminist pedagogy, particularly a black feminist pedagogy. How do we translate our pedagogies across race, across gender, across class and sexuality and nationality and language and so on and so forth, and ability and disability? How do we translate? And so there's some translation. There's some traveling theory, if I can nod to Edward Said. There's some traveling theory that needs to take place where we ask ourselves some questions, John. Some serious critical questions have to be asked of Black studies scholars. Edward Said says, what is it that a theory loses when it travels, but also what does it gain? So I'm trying to say, yes, I might have lost some steps when I first got out here, but I hope you can see with our brand new Center for African and African American Studies, which I founded in 2021, finally, a lot later than most other public universities, but we have it now. Look at the ground that we gained. And I also want to point out, John, before you get it twisted and get me all bent backwards, I founded this center before my friend Coach Prime got out here. Right? So this center was founded before Coach Prime got out here. And so there's a kind of momentum. There's a kind of Boulder School of Black Studies, right, that we're building out here. And as you know, next year would be my 20th year out here. I mean, most of the scholars come and go. John, are you aware that I actually have the tenure line that was once occupied by Manning Marable?
Really?
This is his tenure line. They bring in one Black radical scholar, right? So after Manning Marable vacated this position, then they brought in the very illustrious Joy James, who also occupied this position. So again, there's been a level of sort of Black radical thought, Black radical history, Black radical culture, Black radical teaching. But Manning Marable was out here 1989 to 1993, at which time he went on to Columbia, right, which was his last post, but he ended up getting a Pulitzer Prize, you see. So like what would happen if we could take some of the resources? That means that I have to be willing to do some social sacrificing. I have been out here, John, true story, and I have gone a week, an entire week, 5 to 7 days, and not seen another Black person in Boulder, Colorado. I'm telling the truth, right? And talk about Billie Holiday. I could play some Torch songs for you right now, but we ain't got time for that. But John, to a Black studies scholar, there's something that's disconcerting, right? I mean, that's really, truly disconcerting. But now look at the way we're building a beloved community out here. We're saying, yes, this center's primarily for Black folk, but secondarily, it's for people like you, Brother John. It's for allies. I've always envisioned that. In my vision for Black studies, it's expansive. Yes, Africans, African Americans, Caribbean folk, Afro-Latinx folks need, right, this Black studies thing, this Africana studies thing, this African diaspora thing. But at the same time, there are a lot of other groups who would join us in the work we are doing if we would simply say, as they do in Swahili, Karibu, welcome. You found yourself in a peaceful place, a place where you can grow to your fullest potential. It's going to take some work, right? But I'm not asking you all to do something I'm not doing, right? I'm struggling every day, a luta continua. I'm challenging myself every day. I'm trying to unlearn some of the stuff that they indoctrinated us with, right? They called it higher education. See, that's a problem, Judd. We also have to talk about Black studies and the dialectic of deconstruction and reconstruction. This is at the heart of Africana Critical Theory. So you can't just go and deconstruct. You can't just go and you have to reconstruct. You have to give the people something to hold on to. That's why I'm still teaching hip hop 25 years later after leaving the East Coast. I'm still man, my classes was killing the game. In grad school, come on, man. Come on, when I taught at Philadelphia Community College, man, when I taught at Temple University, when I went over there to the University of Pennsylvania, hip hop, man, the roots was in Philly. Come on, man. It was Jill Scott was in Philly. Music Soul Child was in Philly. Jaguar Wright was in Philly. I mean, it was an incredible situation. The way, again, as you know, back then my specialization was jazz rap, hence the roots, right? Right. So my specialization and the work that I've done on jazz rap in particular, but I could already see the connections. I'm going to say it slow, John. I could already see the connections from the Harlem Renaissance to the Black Arts movement to the hip hop movement. See, it's like every 30 years, Black folk was creating these incredible, explosive, artistic cultures. And then, John, you have to broach the subject of the staying power of rap music and hip hop culture. 50 years, they talk about 50-year anniversary. What is it about the hip hop movement that has allowed it such staying power where you actually, I'm teaching a class right now. I got to wake up tomorrow morning. I'm teaching my marquee class, which is my introduction to hip hop studies class, right? Come on. What is that about? I think some of it has to do with Black folk have always had a unique relationship to technology because in America, we started out as the technology. I'm just being real. I'm being like Tupac Shakur. I'm keeping it real. We are the OT, the original technology. I ain't said OG. I said OT. So our relationship to technology, if you think about it, John, I don't want to date, I don't want to give away your age, but if you think about the LPs, right? The albums, records. You think about 8-track, right? Eight
I
track.
own some.
You see what I'm saying?
I own some, yes.
And then if you think about cassette tapes, then after that, CDs, then after that, MP3s and so. Black folk, like hip hop came along at a time where there was a digital revolution going on. There was a computer revolution going on. And it also meant that we could document more of our own lives. We didn't need to go to Hollywood. We didn't need to go to some wealthy philanthropist somewhere. We have the technology right now. Man, I can make beats on my phone. I got a small little recording studio app on my phone. I can make beats and blaze over the, man, if you see my classroom, students lose their minds up in there. Why? Because you actually have a professor that is profoundly influenced by the African American church, by the jazz aesthetic, but also by the hip hop aesthetic. So some of that cipher circle vibe comes through in the classroom. And also, I'm not sitting around demonizing people. Black studies is not about tearing anybody or anything down. Black studies is actually about building something up. See, they tried to tear us down for 250 years, right? 1619 to 1865. We need to spend the next 250 years building something up. And let's build it the way our ancestors did those pyramids so that they will withstand the test of time.
I love that. Yeah, fantastic. Well, I mean, I think in some ways this next question I had, I think you've answered or responded, given a lot of words to this, but I'll just ask it in this particular way, which is, it's interesting thinking back on the people who've been on the podcast. A lot of people have, done, say, a history PhD. They're in Black studies, philosophy PhD, Black studies. Some people have done, Black studies PhD and work in Black studies, and that's actually uncommon, not very common. I have a long thought on that about how we don't value our own PhDs sometimes. But I'm interested in hearing you reflect a little bit on how, having done your PhD in a Department of African American Studies and then teaching in a Department of Ethnic Studies, doing, as you said, the director's work for the Center for African and African American Studies, you've spent your academic life in area studies rather than a discipline, haven't transitioned out of a discipline into area studies. And I'm curious how you think that time from the very beginning of your PhD training to the present, being spent in area studies has impacted your sense of what it means to do scholarship, but also what it means to make a classroom, what it means to teach.
This is a really powerful question. And I want to speak gently because it is very moving to me. When you talk about how Black studies often doesn't hire people with graduate degrees often in Black studies, there's a tendency to, I don't know, like it's odd because people can gatekeep within our own field. Even as I say that, I'm still epistemically open from the knowledge of Black studies scholars that come from, who have training in various fields. So I don't want to get all like intellectual territorial or intellectual terrain. That's just not something that I'm interested in. However, my own career, I think, has been impacted by some of the gatekeeping that happens where, I've applied to teaching African American studies departments where sometimes not a single faculty member has a graduate degree in African American studies, and they can block me out, or I don't know, for whatever reason, just not vibe with it. Again, of course, I think I'm, I'm not everybody's cup of tea. That's cool with me. It's not a popularity contest, and everything. But yeah, that's something that really gets me. John, are you aware that I actually had a full ride in philosophy for a PhD? Paid for, full ride. And I purposely switched out and went into African American studies because even getting a PhD, even trying to get the PhD in philosophy, they said they couldn't support the kind of work I wanted to do. I wanted to focus on obviously African American philosophy, Caribbean philosophy, and continental African philosophy. And so even in the traditional philosophy department, mainstream philosophy department, it was not. And so again, I wondered, as you probably know, I worked with Lucius Turner Outlaw Jr. I also consider Louis Ricardo Gordon a mentor in terms of my Africana philosophy training. Mm-hmm. And Lucius Outlaw sat me down and said, listen, Brother Rabaka, you get the PhD in African American studies. There's not a philosophy department in the country that's going to hire you. They hire their own. And I said, well, Dr. Outlaw, why is it then that Black studies will hire somebody, with the PhD in philosophy, sociology, and history? But I mean, something is odd here where there's this kind of devaluation of Black studies degrees, even within Black studies. That's a problem. We need to broach this subject. It's a taboo topic, right? And again, even as I say it, John, please do not edit this out. I'm very open to people coming from other areas. And I think that's what makes Black studies so discursively dynamic, is that we actually are very epistemically open to epistemology, methodology, praxeology from other disciplines, but the inverse does not always hold true. So there's a real issue, and you can see that some of these people have internalized this. If you're trained in another field, it's going to be better, everything. I mean, as you might know, I started out at a teaching heavy, my career, teaching career, and the professorate at a teaching heavy institution, Cal State Long Beach, California State University, Long Beach. At the time, I had a 5-5 teaching load. I taught 5 classes in the fall, 5 classes in the spring.
I'm John, a veteran of a 5-5 load too, by the way.
Serious?
I spent a few years. Yeah, that's rough.
Bless your heart.
I get it.
Bless your heart. So you're a vet. I can talk to you in a real kind. John, yeah. How were you able to publish though? I mean, how were you able to do research with a 5-5? I mean, it's virtually impossible unless you're willing to sacrifice having a private life or something. Yeah, I mean, it's truly, the toll it takes on your nervous system, your digestive system, your health, your social life. I mean, it's virtually impossible. And so we've created a situation where most of the people with graduate degrees in Black studies get hamstrung often at community colleges or teaching heavy institutions. And it's rare to get an opportunity to be at a research one. And so when the University of Colorado Boulder came calling, really, I think there was a part of me that was excited to occupy the position that was formerly held by Manning Marable and Joy James. But I need to be perfectly honest with you, John. I only planned to stay for 2 or 3 years. This was, this institution has a reputation for being a revolving door institution for Black studies scholars. You come in, get some of the resources, and you go somewhere else, right? And I have been campaigning to create this new center for African and African American studies since 2005 when I came here. I came here on July 27, 2005. And I was shocked that a major Research One university did not have a Black Studies Center or a Black Cultural Center or an Africa House or anything like that. And it took me a long time. It took me a very long time to do it. But I didn't give up. There's a part of me, like my intellectual idol, W.B. Du Bois. I have a fierce sense of intellectual independence. I can be very stubborn when it comes to these kinds of things. And for me, it was the right thing to do. As things are not perfect, but I think it's almost a situation where the administration said, if we can't beat him, we better go ahead and join him because he's got this platform right now. He's running around here talking about Black Lives Matter. We better go ahead. And so part of the groundswell for how we've got over the hump was, unfortunately, the murder of Sandra Bland, the murder of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and certainly George Floyd. And so Boulder was, just like America, was ready for a kind of reckoning. And so here I am out here at one of the most undiverse campuses at that time in the United States of America. And I wanted folks to know that we were here and that we were concerned. And so at a time when we only had about 800 Black students, we got 1,700 signatures for, we started a petition for this center. So at a time when we only had about 800 students, we got about 1,700 signatures. And so you can see we had a lot of non-Black allies, people that understood that I wasn't the angry Black man, that Black studies, isn't the big bad boogie man or woman, and that this is something that actually would enhance intellectually, culturally, socially, the University of Colorado. And I went around, did a lot of meetings, and had to do a lot of explaining about a field, as you pointed out, that's been around since the late 1960s, at least in terms of the American Academy, like formed like it is. Of course, I argue that Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson and them, what they used to call Negro studies goes all the way back to the Harlem Renaissance period, if not before that, in the work of W.B. Du Bois, to be honest with you. And so the origins, I do think, John, we need to do a better job of looking at the pre-1960s origins.
I agree.
Of Black studies, to be perfectly honest with you. We also need to guard against those people that are trained in a specific discipline of only sort of doing sort of like the history of Black literary studies, or the history of Black historical studies, or the history of Black sociological studies. And it needs to be something much more integrated, where we have consistently had people working in areas outside of Black studies who are making profound contributions to Black studies, the evolution of Black studies, the discursive dynamism, if you will, of our field. So again, I hope you hear, I'm actually epistemically open. There's no epistemic closure here. I am incredibly open to the contributions of scholars that come from fields outside of it. And I think sometimes, John, I don't know if you know the toll that it takes to get a PhD in Black studies, because sometimes you have folks who want to create disciples. Sometimes you have folks who basically, again, because they are so, they often go uncredited. And what they do is often so co-opted that they sometimes want to create mini-me's. And I think that's why you can see one of the distinctions of the center I've created, the Center for African and African American Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. I want there to be an intense intellectual openness. I don't seek to recreate, this is not Rabaka studies. No, this is Black studies. This is African American studies, right? You don't have to be like, in fact, I would bless you for not. I wouldn't wish this on anybody coming from the projects and you have to knuckle and brawl your way into the professorate. I wouldn't wish this on anybody, John. And so I'm really open to everybody. In fact, one of the slogans of my center is everybody has their special contribution to make to the cause. So the cause is what we call the center, right? The CAAAS, is hip hop. So the cause, right? And so
I like that.
And so if you ask me, Brother John, what is the cause? The cause is human liberation and social transformation. The cause is social justice, racial justice, gender justice, economic justice, environmental justice. I could do this all day, John. You understand what I'm saying? Like, in fact, all I'm saying is coming down in the tradition of Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, the godmother and the godfather. You have to be committed to a great cause. You're not a Black studies scholar if you're not deeply and profoundly committed to a great cause. And for many of us, John, I'm including you, Black studies scholar, Dr. Drabinsky, the great cause that we are committed to, it's not singular. It's plural. John, I submit to you, I'm not simply deeply and profoundly committed to racial justice. I'm also committed to gender justice, to economic justice, to environmental justice, to people's right to better health care, better quality of life. I'm very profoundly committed to prisoners' rights. You see, to people with different abilities and disabilities. I'm very committed to immigrant rights. See, Black studies is much more expansive. Some people, I hate to say it, I'm finna broach the subject. I don't want to get you in trouble, John. Some people in our field are still, their departments or programs are modeled on a very sort of old school 1960s model of Black studies, where it's still basically race and class. So it's almost like gender and sexuality. You know, all the incredible explosive work that has taken place in the last 50 years, it's almost like it didn't happen. And all I'm saying to you is that my conception of African American studies is an intersectional conception of African American studies. It's also a conception of Black studies that accounts for honest and authentic allies. I'm interested in challenging our allies, and I know that we have them, to become our advocates. See, that means if I get hit with the rubber bullet, John, you better get hit with it too, or else I'm gonna talk about you. Right? If they hose me down, you better end up wet too, brother. I'm just saying, or at least I'm being honest.
I get it.
I didn't run behind your back, John. I didn't run behind your back. I'm saying it to your face as I look at you dead in your face right now. That's real. See, that's solidarity. That's real. A real ally, right, is right there with me. See, that's what I'm talking about. We have to move beyond simply saying beautiful words and make sure to align our words with our deeds. This is one of the great lessons of Frederick Douglass' autobiographies, plural, right? I mean, there were so many. He wanted to document his life and quest for liberation. That's very profound. And in fact, you and I both know, John, we need to be teaching the epistemology that grows out of the narratives of our enslaved ancestors. There's a lot of philosophical discourse. There's a lot of moral and ethical, right, treatises and articulations that we could learn a great deal. But if they stigmatize our enslavement, if we don't really know anything about it, or if we run around simply calling it, quote unquote, the slave trade. Now, what was traded? Right? I'm just saying, like, how is it a trade? Like that's placing all the emphasis on the economics and not the ethics. A real Black studies interpretation of the enslavement. I also say enslavement, John, because I'm saying it's a temporary position. See, if it was permanent, Lord have mercy, excuse me. If it was permanent, Brother John, we probably wouldn't know Harriet Tubman's name.
Yeah. If
it was permanent, my kind sir, I submit to you, we probably wouldn't be calling Frederick Douglass's name. We couldn't read his work. I couldn't tell you how he was the editor of the North Star, among other. Right? I'm just saying, though, if it was permanent. See, that's how you know they only attempted to dehumanize the ancestors. They did not succeed. And in fact, I submit to you, John, as we begin to close out, I submit to you, Professor of Black Studies, that I've thought about it long and hard. And if they attempted to enslave us, to dehumanize us, if they attempted to dehumanize us for 250 years, we need to spend the next 250 years rehumanizing. We need a rehumanization at the heart of real Black studies, a radical conception of Black studies. The entire project is a rehumanization project. They attempted. We're only 158 or only 159 years after our enslavement. My grandmother's 97 years old, John. Do the math. My grandmother's grandmother experienced Juneteenth down in Texas. My grandmother. My grandmother's grandmother experienced what she called Jubilee Day, Freedom Day. I'm just saying it's that recent. So if you really want to say, well, how did you get involved? It's my grandmother who only went to the 9th grade, right? It's my mother and them, my mama and them. They're the ones, folks that never went. I'm first generation. Nobody in my family ever went to a college or university. And it's that kind of cultural grounding. It's that kind of cultural knowledge that doesn't simply take place in higher education, but it takes place sitting around my grandmother's kitchen table. right? It takes place going out in my grandmother's garden, and we garden together, right? And she shares the stories about her mama, which is her grandmother, who experienced enslavement, right? And remembers the Freedom Day. John, this is, so African Americans, John, a real Black studies scholar needs to acknowledge that African Americans, Black people, have spent more time in shackles and chains in this country than we have in so-called freedom.
Yeah, that was really wonderfully put and really moving. Thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, this notion of humanization, rehumanization, dehumanization as a way of sort of organizing really the core, and I mean core like the center of an atom. It's like everything is going to move around this dynamic. I really love the way you put that, and maybe that's partly an answer to this. I'll ask this as our closing question. Thinking about Black studies today, and it's very interesting for me to ask this. This is the first time I've asked this question post-election. I don't know if it has an impact on this, but Black studies today, what is the question you think we should all be asking? What is it, something that you think we should all be thinking about?
For me, how can we all be a little more human? A little more humane? How can we make sure that we continue to live out loud? Make sure that we continue to live out loud, but that other people also are able to live out loud as well. I think that, to sound like Malcolm X, human rights, this emphasis on human rights, whether people run around calling it DEI or belonging or whatever the latest, buzzwords are, I think that we are still preoccupied with the relationality between human rights and American democracy. Right. And so when James Baldwin talks about and questions in The Fire Next Time whether we have really achieved American democracy or whether it's just like a beautiful idea, I would say to you what Frantz Fanon said in The Wretched of the Earth, when Frantz Fanon said, each generation must out of relative obscurity discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. We need to make some generational contributions. All I would say to you, John, is what is going to be the contribution of our generation of Black studies scholars and students? What is our great contributions? I think right now what you are doing, taking the technology and documenting far and wide, right? Sometimes you're interviewing scholars who many of us may not agree with each other. But for me, it's beside the point. That's the beauty of having a critical Black mass. We don't have to agree on everything. We don't have to. It's not necessary. People need to stop that. We got a lot of Black police in Black studies. They be policing people's intellectual thought and their culture and their sexuality and they this and that and the other. We need to stop it. Black people have been policed since come on now, we tired of it. So for me, I'm really interested. I'm preoccupied with freedom, human freedom. I'm preoccupied with human choice. I'm very interested in the concept of Afro-modernism. So if you say, well, what I feel like is really needed right now, the real Black studies scholar is a modernist. They're very in tune with the contemporaneous, with what's happening right here, right now, and in some way, they make their work speak to what's happening right here, right now, right? And this is it's only through Afro-modernism that we can actually have some Afro-futurism. But you got to deal with the present before you can project yourself in the future. And Marcus Garvey at Liberty Hall, 1917, when he said, if you don't know your past, you'll never know your future. The past. There's something about connecting past, present, and future. I think if we go too far in the futuristic direction, there's nobody more interested in futurity than I am. I mean, did you see my new book, John, called The Funk Movement, where I explore Afro, I do like an Afro-futuristic interpretation of funk music and say that in the 1970s, at the same time, they were developing this thing called Afro-futurist literature with Octavia Butler and the like, the music by label, the music of an Earth, Wind, and Fire, right? Reflected. The music of Parliament Funkadelic with Mothership Connection, the music reflected this sort of Afrofuturist impulse that was going on. And I'm really preoccupied when Parliament Funkadelic talks about Afronauts instead of astronauts. Talk about Afro extraterrestrials, right? I mean, there's a sense in which we need to be able to embrace a kind of fantasy, a kind of play, even a kind of escapism. Like, we need to be able to chill and to relax and to practice self-care. I mean, this is one of the things being active in the Black Lives Matter movement taught me. I mean, there were sometimes we would go to meetings and we would just have listening sessions. We'd listen to music. We'd have poetry readings. People would get up and do dance. I mean, this is how therapeutic Black art is for not simply Black people, but for all people, right? I mean, it's a very powerful, powerful thing. I also think, John, we need to be realistic about addressing hurt. We need to acknowledge it. And it's only by addressing hurt that we can actually turn toward healing. See, that's where some of these things become therapeutic. And I think for me, when I step to the lectern, there's something healing about it. I was a little kid that had a stuttering problem so badly that for a lot of my childhood, I was mute, because they would make fun of me. But after all those diction and speech and elocution classes, listen to my mother's middle son now, John. I mean, can you imagine when you go, like there are a lot of us who are Black studies scholars and students who we were going to school and they were mostly giving us a very sort of colonial curriculum. And then something happens when they let you write your first paper on your first chosen topic and you choose the Harlem Renaissance.
Yeah.
And you get an A on that paper. In fact, you might have got an A+. And so you realize like, wow, there's a whole nother way that I could be educating, practicing self-education like Frederick Douglass, practicing self-education. What I tell my students, you have to take 2 sets of notes. One set of notes to pass the class, the other sets of notes, those are your Black studies notes, where you can sort of develop your ability to critique and appreciate, even if you're in a British literature class. Right? Even if you in the most mainstream of classes, how do you make sure that you keep a Black positionality, a Black standpoint, a Black perspective on things? And John, we need to close out by talking about the necessity, the utility of having a Black perspective on things. An African American, especially when you start talking about America, an African American perspective on American history is profound. An African American perspective on American politics, on the American medical industry, on American religious institutions. There's something about that for me that I see it as a space of a site of knowledge, a source of knowledge. For me, that's what Black studies is about. That's the great contribution of Black studies to American higher education, is that we're able to offer up some alternative knowledges, some alternative social vision, some alternative political critique and social commentary that otherwise there's some special truths that we are able to speak that I don't know. I just don't know. Again, I'm open to the knowledge coming from a lot of other fields, but I think that's what makes, that's the distinction of various disciplines, is that they do certain things quite well. They offer up certain knowledges, certain methodologies and epistemologies in ways that no other discipline may do it. And so I also think, John, this is also what makes Black studies so attractive to scholars who come from other fields, that they find a kind of intellectual freedom, a kind of intellectual camaraderie, a kind of intellectual culture here that is often more open than it is closed. I'm not saying you don't have pockets of centers and programs and departments in our field that are very sort of closed, or they seem that way. But I'm saying I think that we are part of a generation of scholars and students that epistemic openness is our watchword. Being open to new knowledges, and that's our watchword. Being open to knowledges not simply from the past, but synthesizing those knowledges from the past with knowledge in the present to project ourselves into the future. I like it so much when the Black art scholar Larry Neal One of my favorite books by Larry Neal is called Visions of a Liberated Future. That, for me, is a major preoccupation. I'm preoccupied with a liberated future.
I love this. Thank you so much. I mean, the two things really stood out for me there as a way of closing this that I really love. This question of intellectual openness and freedom. I mean, I think that's what Black Studies does. It's what I love about the field. I like the chaos of it. I like the imaginative elements, right? Because it's not only freeing, but like all good kinds of freedom, it also brings all kinds of responsibilities.
Absolutely.
As you say, responsibilities to thinking about the past and future in order to, and if I can just say it again, what you said, I really love this question for us all to ask, what is our contribution?
Mm-hmm.
I love that. Thank you so much, Reiland. This has been a fantastic conversation. I was really looking forward to it, and this exceeded everything I had hoped for from it. So I appreciate your time, but I really appreciate your passion and your thoughtfulness and your imagination here today. This has been absolutely excellent. Thank you.
John, I just want to close out by saying I appreciate you. I appreciate you using your platform and whatever privileges you may have, you're using them progressively. And I want to encourage you. Be encouraged in the work that you're doing. And I also want to say, John, do you understand that you and I, we are ambassadors for African studies, for African American studies, for Caribbean studies, for Black studies? It's important for us to think of ourselves as ambassadors, that we want to go around and share and showcase the best of what it means to be a Black studies scholar or a Black studies student.
I love that. Thank you. All right. Well, again, thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Take care of yourself, brother. Peace.
You too. Bye-bye.